On tonight's show, my Friday friends, star historian David Oldroyd-Bolt and fearless political commentator Emma Burnell. Emma, were you inspired by the words of the Prime Minister?
I thought I agreed with pretty much everything he said. I think it was quite hard.
That before.
And I very rarely say that I agree.
I'm going to make that a meme.
Absolutely, I know. I'll never live it down.
The BBC won't have you back.
I'm not sure they have me in the first place. But I also kind of felt a bit meh at the end of it. I didn't feel like there was something that came out of that speech that made me feel, I know why I tuned into on my television in this unprecedented moment at 5:40 on a Friday night. 5:40 on a Friday night for the Prime Minister to bring out his podium and make a speech is usually they make an announcement. And I didn't hear an announcement in that speech. So that, I am a partisan lefty. And when I say lefty, I do not include George Galloway in that.
And you want a Labour government?
I want a Labour government, but I feel it's important in moments like this that when I believe the Prime Minister is right, I say so. Because I think that's how we restore trust in politics, is not just simply saying, well, if they've said it is wrong and if they've said it is right. You have to take things on an issue-by-issue basis. But as I said, I agreed with the sentiment of the speech wholeheartedly. I just didn't feel there was that much there.
Now, David Oldroyd-Bolt, I know you were not bowled over by the speech, but this is stronger and more powerful than anything we would get from Keir Starmer, who will likely be our next Prime Minister.
To say I was not bowled over is a massive understatement. It was rather like someone standing outside a burning house and saying we're aware of a problem with rising heat in the sitting room. This is the most pressing issue of public order and safety, and it has been for many, many years. The fact is that the Tory party and the Labour Party are equally afraid of considering why this happens, why it is such a danger, and how it is possible to go about ameliorating that danger. I don't think there is any difference in Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak in this, because they're both equally afraid of the reality.
And I totally agree. And, of course, it's a bit of a talking shop at the moment, and we need action, don't we? But I can't imagine Keir Starmer making a speech like that because he was so afraid of offending British Muslims.
Well, quite. He knows his client vote and he's not going to piss them off, is he? That's
I mean, I think
Would you accept that? Would you accept
no,
that?
I think that's unfair. We saw the clip of him being incredibly and rightly rude about George Galloway and his division.
Prime Minister?
No, Keir Starmer. We saw his clip during Tatiana's bit too. So actually, I think they were speaking from one hymn sheet, and I think that's important. And I think, again, I come back to what I was just saying. If we, as people who believe in democracy, want to stop the extremists from either end taking over, we have to not make this false equivalence between where Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak may sit somewhere on their roughly agreeing tracks, and then and stop trying to say, oh, Keir Starmer's a friend of his client vote. We really shouldn't talk like that.
But if you're going to talk about false equivalence, there is no equivalence between the threat of the far right and the threat of Islamism. And I use the word Islamism specifically to define it against the normal, everyday, decent Muslim population of this country. In the past 20 years, how many attacks on public people, figures...
Well, one, she was my friend.
Yes, and that was one. It was appalling and tragic. But how many have been from the Islamist threat? 7/7 bombings? The London Bridge attacks, the killing of David Amess. This is not an equivalent.
Well, OK, go back further. You've got the Lord Admiral bombing. Yeah, that was a far-right bomber. The nail bombs in Brick Lane. The point I'm trying to make is
MI5 aren't worried about the far right, even though it's a concern. They're worried about Islamism, aren't they?
And they are right to be worried about the extremists. But what I'm saying
because they're a moderate Islamist. Islamism is, by definition, an extremist, a violent and an unreasonable
But again,
ideology.
they are a small portion of the vast, very peaceful Muslim population we just need to be really, really careful with our rhetoric on this.
The proportion is not germane. What is germane is that they are aggressive and they have a hatred for everything that makes our society.
But if I said that bomber or the person who killed Joe Cox is endemic, is indicative of everybody whose right-wing politics I disagree with. You'd rightly pull me up on that. And I would say the same thing on this.
But I have said now 3 times that Islamism is not equivalent to Islam.
But I'm not saying it is. I'm saying
so
that...
that's not, again, it's a false
equivalence. It's not a false equivalence. Islamism is an extremism. Right-wing extremism is an extremism. We should deal with both of these things without saying that one side, Labour's more supportive of one, the Tories are more supportive of the other. That's not the kind of politics we should be having.
The tragedy of Jo Cox, and you mentioned the nail bomber in Soho and horrible, horrible things. But is the threat of right-wing terrorism, which is a concern and it's reprehensible, is it a red herring in the context of the threat of Islamic extremism?
I don't think...
Is it silly to put the two things in the same sentence?
No, because I think what the problem is extremism. I think they probably...
But don't you need to focus on the biggest threat?
I think you need to focus on all threats. If you don't... Okay. I don't think that you should take your eye off the Islamist ball at all. Those extremists need to be dealt with. They need to be locked up. I have no problem with that. I believe extremism is the problem. And I think one of the issues is that both of those two sets of extremists are winding each other up and making the whole thing worse.
Very briefly,
we have a duty as Democrats to stop that on both sides.
Very briefly, do you think that the so-called peace marches, in which some have marched for peace, I know people that have gone there because they want the murder to end, the death to end, but have those marches been weaponised by extremists, do you think?
I'm sure they have. I haven't gone on any of those marches. I find the whole thing impossibly complicated. And I walked past, I was in Westminster, and I walked past the demonstration happening outside at the same time as the vote. And I sort of thought to myself, as a journalist, maybe I should go and have a look at what was happening. Yeah. And then I thought, no, I don't want to be photographed there. And I think back to going on the march against the war in Iraq and how broad that was in terms of the population.
Most definitely.
And that really does worry me.
OK, very briefly, David, you get the last word.
Thank you. Well, I would say it wasn't a demonstration outside Parliament. It was outright intimidation and aggression. And that is the problem, that members of Parliament are being prevented from doing their democratic duty by an extremely aggressive, outrightly violent group of people who put their lives under threat and the lives of all of us under threat.